tonight to the book of Esther. Hopefully you can remember the storyline from last week. If you're like me, I look at so many things during the week, I forget. So maybe we can ring a bell if we talk about some of it. Before we get though into the text itself, we want to look at question number 1 on our handout. Kind of a think about question, deals really with the idea tonight that we're going to talk about specifically. I think at least 2 individuals who are very brave. But the question is this: what do you think makes some people brave and some people cowardly? The situation? Okay. That's a pretty good answer.
Past experiences.
Past experiences would definitely come into play with it.
Success or failure.
Yeah, sometimes when you try something and you fail at it, you're less, well, I would say you are probably less likely to try it again. Anything else?
Passion for the whatever particular period there might be, such as what they believe in.
Okay, so whatever is popular during the current time, day, ages.
Or
Belief, yeah. Anything else comes to mind? Because tonight we're going to read about 2 people at least who put their life on the line. And not everybody would be willing to do that. Go ahead.
I think bravery is sitting and you have to decide. Like you keep this thing on right. Those people are like, I'm going to do it. And then they go.
Okay, yeah, I would agree with that. Some people are more prone to go than others, aren't they? I was kind of thinking about it, and to me, I guess maybe all these are really good answers, and of course, all of them have to do exactly with, I think, why people are either choose to be brave or choose to be cowardly. But I really think at the root of all of it is kind of a value system. What do you value the most? And generally speaking, what do you think people value the most today? We would go around, and poll 100 people today and say, what is the most, or what is the thing that you value the most? Themselves? Well, that wouldn't be wrong. I doubt they would be that honest, though. But what is it, do you think, that everybody would put at the top of the list? Family? Okay. Somebody else say something?
Self-preservation.
Self-preservation. I think life would be at the top of the list, don't you? I think everybody values their own life. And what would people do to keep living? What would they give? I think they'd give about anything they had, wouldn't you? And so you think back, you look at people who we would consider brave people, and I think what you could probably say if you looked at their value system, that keeping their physical life wasn't at the top. In other words, there were some things that were more important to them, that they valued more than even their own life. And you look at Esther and you look at Mordecai, I think you could say that about them too. I mean, they definitely risked their life, but I think they did it because they had a value system where, their physical preservation or living here in this life wasn't necessarily at the top of the list. There were things that were more important to them than that. But they are 2 very unique people, of course, in the book of Esther here. So last week, if you didn't remember, I'll just mention real briefly here, we were introduced to a man by the name of Haman. And remember that Haman was basically promoted to a very high position. I would even venture to say, as you read through this, he was probably one of the top counselors of the king, as his position is described here in some of the interactions that you read about here. There were how many were there? 7 at the beginning that were kind of advisors or counselors to the king. I have to check my number there back in chapter 1. But I would venture to say that he was probably one of those 7 men. But he didn't like Jews, and particularly there was one guy who he really didn't like, and that was Mordecai, and he was a Jew too. And so he kind of went a roundabout way, and he basically approached the king and said, hey, there's this group of people whose laws aren't like our laws, and they don't obey the laws of the king that you've passed. And so here's what I propose. Let's get rid of these people. And when I get rid of these people, then I'll take all the spoils from them and I'll put them into the Persian treasury, and we'll build the Persian Empire and treasury back up, because remember, it had been depleted because of war. So it seems like the king didn't ask very many questions. And I would say generally, if you were a counselor or advisor to a king, he probably trusted you more than he did other people. And so he said, it sounds good to me, you do what you got to do. And so Haman put a royal decree into effect that on a set day, all the Jews could be killed, and you could take all their stuff. And so that was a royal commandment that went throughout the kingdom. So that's kind of where we're picking up here in chapter 4. Look at question 2 on your handout here. How did Mordecai and the Jews react to the king's edict?
Well, the ranch closed. Just, warning and all kinds of things.
Yeah, so you read about their reaction, and of course, their reaction is one of shock, it's one of grief, it's one of seriousness and reflection. It said within there that they fasted because of it, usually very closely associated, although it's not stated specifically in the text, is praying with fasting. You'll find those two hand in hand throughout God's Word. But think about this question. Why didn't they just pack their stuff up and move? What do you mean they couldn't?
Well, they were in effect slaves to the.
Yeah, they were carried away captives and put into the Persian Empire. And so even if you were a Jew who had gone back to Jerusalem with the decree of Cyrus, and remember they rebuilt the temple, the Persian Empire still ruled over it. That was still their territory. And so if you were living in Jerusalem as a Jew, there was a law that said on a set day, your enemies could come kill you. You think there's anybody who wanted to kill those Jews in Jerusalem who rebuilt the temple? Yeah, we've already studied that. There were a lot of them, weren't they? They had a lot of enemies. A lot of people didn't want them there. And the Persian Empire, it wasn't like just one little space on the map. We're talking about, you would have had to travel a tremendous distance to even get outside of the rule of the Persian Empire. So it wasn't like it was something that you could escape if you were a Jew and this law that went into effect. Like, we as Americans, we might think, well, I just moved to another country. Well, they were slaves, couldn't do that. Even if you were in your homeland, you were in danger. And even if you tried to run away, you'd have to run forever to get outside of the Persian Empire. And it's been estimated, I don't know for sure, nobody does, but there were as many as 15 million Jews in the Persian Empire at this time. So we're not talking about a real small group of people over here. We're talking about a pretty substantial number of people throughout the Persian Empire. And they didn't really have any place to go. Didn't really have anything that they could do. And so what do you do when you got no place to go and there's nothing you can do about something?
You accept it.
Well, you could, I guess. What do we do? You turn to God?
That probably started a while back.
Yeah, well, it shouldn't it? Yeah, and there was a lot of fasting that was going on. There was a lot of mourning. There was a lot of weeping and wailing. Like I said, prayer would have been part of that also. But the Jews were they were in a bind. They were in a situation where they desperately needed help. And what does Mordecai himself do specifically? Yeah, he mourns, but he does it in an open and a public way, doesn't he? You know, for the first time, you kind of read throughout the story that they're trying to keep their heritage a secret. And now all of a sudden he's out here in the open and he's letting it be known, you know, I'm part of the Jewish race, that I'm a descendant of Abraham, and this is a tragedy. What's fixing to happen here is not good. So the Bible says he dressed in sackcloth and ashes. He walked throughout the city, cried very loudly, very bitterly. And if think about this, if you were, sometimes you get around people and on certain issues, you know, you just don't know where they stand. You think people knew where Mordecai stood? I think there was probably no doubt in their minds, right? And that's the kind of stuff that we need as Christians, isn't it? Kind of stuff where people can outwardly identify us, see who we are, know what we stand for. So question number 3 here, what did Esther do when she heard that Mordecai was in mourning? Mordecai goes all around the city, and then he comes to the king's gates, and he stops there. And of course, a message is brought to Esther as the queen that Mordecai is out there, and he's dressed in sackcloth and ashes, and he's crying and he's screaming bitterly. So what does Esther do whenever she hears about Mordecai?
She sends her, the guy who's supposed to be watching over him, out to find out what's going on.
Yeah, well, the second time, she really makes more of an inquiry. But the first time, what does she do? She does send this guy out, right? What does he take with him?
Some clothes.
Some clothes. Why? You know what's significant about that? Yeah, it was a Persian law that you were not allowed to come around the king if you were dressed in sackcloth. And, you know, like so many of these empires, and again, these weren't, you know, like we think of, these weren't Christian or godly people, these were pagan people. But if you were in a bad mood or you were sad, you weren't supposed to come around the king. Only happy people were supposed to be around the king. And so if the king, you know, here he is, he's standing outside the king's gate. King walks by and sees him. I mean, there's a danger of him getting put to death right there on the spot. King hears him screaming and yelling and you know, crying out there. Then there's a real threat that he could be put to death because of that. And so immediately, the very first thing that she does is send him some clothes out there and says, give him these clothes and tell him to change. But Mordecai, of course, refuses to do that, doesn't he? How does Esther eventually discover the reason behind Mordecai's grief? Kind of interesting to start with. She didn't ask the question, did she? First thing you get is those clothes sent out there and say, get them these clothes. But when he wouldn't put them on and change, she wanted to know the reason for his grief. And Dennis, he already mentioned it a little bit earlier there, a little bit before, but she did send one of her servants, one of the eunuchs that was under her service, to go out and to figure out, you know, why in the world is he out there in the first place? Why won't he change? And so probably, I would say that servant was probably one of her more trusted servants that she would have, who she was comfortable, you know, relaying personal messages through. But she sent him out to learn exactly what was going on and why Mordecai was so upset. Mordecai, of course, reveals to her the decree that has gone throughout the kingdom. Evidently, Esther hasn't even heard about it yet, doesn't know anything about it. But he reveals to her that decree, and there's kind of some, you know, interesting information as you read Mordecai describing this royal decree to her. What were some, you know, specific things that Mordecai knew about this particular decree that probably not everybody would have known?
In the decree itself, is that what you're asking?
No, not necessarily. Do you remember what was the motive behind the decree? That's really what I'm after here. Haman's revenge, yeah, but why was it allowed and why was it put into effect? I'm half dead, Tina. You'll have. Yeah, Mordecai knew about the motivation behind the decree and the edict, and so he knew that this plunder that was going to be taken from the Jews was one of the key motivations for the decree. And of course, he knew that Haman was behind it. He knew that Haman had promised a hefty return, to Xerxes and to the Persian treasury if this law was passed and he was allowed to go out and make sure that it was taken care of. But it is kind of interesting, the king didn't even ask about the people. I guess he didn't really even care, did he? I mean, that's kind of the impression that I get from it. And so was he a little bit too trusting of his advisors? I'd say he probably was. If he'd known all the reasoning behind the decree, and I don't know that he would have allowed it to go into effect. But Haman was a pretty manipulative guy too, wasn't he? And so he was kind of preying on the king and his position and, presented it in a way that sounded good and bad. Bad enough that something needed to be done and good enough that it was going to benefit the Persian Empire and the treasury. And so I don't think the king really thought much about it after that. Just figured, well, this guy knows what's best. He's going to have my best interest at heart. And so he allowed that edict to pass. But it is kind of interesting that Mordecai knew a lot of the details behind the decree itself. So question number 6 here, it's one thing to say something, it's another thing to prove it. And so what proof did Mordecai send to Esther through this servant about this royal decree?
Got a copy of the writing.
Yeah, and what would that tell you? That Mordecai has obtained a copy of this royal decree. Do you think everybody got a copy of this decree?
When he sent it out to all the provinces.
They did, yeah, and they posted it in public places, didn't they? But I think what it also indicates is Mordecai evidently had some kind of influence. He might have been part of what we might consider one of the chief of the Jews, and it would have been, if he were, it would have been fitting that a copy would have been, delivered to him, or maybe Haman just sent it out of spite. He was really the guy that Haman was after anyway, wasn't it? But it is kind of interesting that he did actually have a copy of the royal decree itself. And so he sent it with Esther's servant to deliver it to her so she could see for herself. And again, evidently that's kind of reflection either upon Haman's spite of him or else the position that he was occupying. So Mordecai wants Esther to help the Jews, right? Question number 7 here. In what specific way did Mordecai want Esther to help the Jews? Yeah. So you think about all these Jews in the empire, what could they do about this decree?
Nothing.
Really wasn't anything they could do, right? They didn't have the power, they didn't have the access, the pull, the positions to get this decree reversed. I think that's kind of the thinking along the way, to try to get it reversed, do something about it. But there was one Jew who was in a position who could do something about it, and that was Esther. And so Mordecai tells her, he says, you gotta do something. You gotta go before the king and plead with him to undo this decree, and you gotta save our people. And so Mordecai was pretty straightforward with what he wanted Esther to do. What was the problem with that?
She could get killed herself.
Yeah, there was, again, the Persian law we're talking about here. Nobody was allowed to go and approach the king or go into the presence of the king without an invitation. And so if you just showed up on the spot and said, I need to talk to the king, the king can say, put him to death. Why do you think that is?
They don't want any problem.
Do what?
I don't think king wants any problems.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was to kind of let the king be. You know, if he allowed anybody and everybody to come in and talk to him about what was going on, problems, be nonstop day and night, wouldn't it? So undoubtedly it was to give the king a little bit of relief. It was also, I think, you know, to protect the king. Because if you just let anybody and everybody come in and have access to the king, I mean, there's a threat that, you know, an assassin could sneak in and take the king's life. So if you were not invited and you showed up, then there was a royal decree that said if the king didn't hold out his scepter towards you, and that kind of, you know, that okayed you. But if he didn't hold out the scepter, you were put to death. And so Esther is asking the question here, you know, what's going to happen if I show up and just ask the king for something? You know, there's a chance I could be put to death. Now, a couple of things that, you know, come to my mind when we're talking about this. First of all, does it kind of show you the way that Xerxes treated and thought about women? I mean, who was this? This wasn't just some lady off the street, right? This was his wife. And what was she afraid of? Being put to death. I mean, that tells you a little bit about his character, doesn't it? It tells you a little bit about what kind of person he was. But if your own wife is afraid of you killing her, I'd say there's probably a problem with your relationship, wouldn't you? And that was kind of the situation. Now, women to Xerxes was nothing more than pleasure. That's all they were. And so if you weren't helping him, if you weren't benefiting him, he didn't have any use for you. What happened to Vashti? Remember that story? Yeah, she got dethroned, right? And so you can imagine having already these events already transpiring. There's some real concern on the part of Esther that, you know, I could die. I could actually be put to death for what you're asking me to do. We already covered there, question 8, the exception about a person entering that inner court without being invited. That was, again, if the king held out his golden scepter, you wouldn't die. And here's kind of a little bit of background about where we're at in the time period here. We learn that the decree of Haman is about 4 to 5 years after Esther becomes queen. And so she's been queen now for about 4 to 5 years. And there's another kind of tidbit of information that's offered to us about her relationship with the king in these verses. What is that? Did you notice that? She hadn't even been in the presence of the king for the last 30 days. You didn't just walk into the presence of the king, right? Even if you were the queen, you had to be summoned. And so she hadn't even seen the king in the last 30 days or had an interaction with him in the last 30 days. So kind of given the nature of Xerxes, what would you think if you were her? I'd probably be thinking, you know, I'm in danger of being replaced already, wouldn't you? But that was Xerxes. I mean, that's just the way that he treated women. That's just the way they kind of viewed things. So question number 9, Mordecai says some things to try to help put Esther at ease. How does he try to address the fears that she has?
That you're Jew.
Yeah, I don't know that put her at ease, but the first thing that he tells her is, listen, you know, you're of Jewish descent also. And don't think that just because you're the queen, this isn't going to apply to you. This is Persian law. Okay? Persian law is Persian law all across the board. And so if you're alive and this day comes, don't think that Haman won't come there and kill you too, because he's got it in for the Jews. But he talks to her about that. What else does he tell her?
Well, basically, he says, don't be selfish.
Yeah.
Don't think about yourself, think about all your other Jews.
Yeah, and he approaches it from a theological standpoint too, doesn't he? And he talks about something that we often describe as the providence of God, right? And his reasoning with Esther is basically this: you've been placed on the Persian throne by God. And there's a reason. There's a reason God put you on the Persian throne. There's a reason God made you queen over this nation. And so there was a purpose for her, a divine purpose for her being in the place that she was in at that exact time. And basically, Mordecai is telling her, read the handwriting on the wall. It's obvious. There's a reason why God put you here. There's a reason why, you're in this place and you're at this time. That's one of those things we could talk all night about, the providence of God. But a couple of questions that I just kind of want to throw out here. For today, do you believe that God has divine purposes that he wants accomplished in this world?
Yes.
Or do you think that God has just put the universe in order and stepped away and said, now everything's just going to happen like it happens?
He's got purpose.
Okay. How does God accomplish those purposes? It's through people, isn't it? Sometimes it's bad people. Sometimes it's good people. Does he use the church today to accomplish his purposes here in this earth? Yeah, he uses people. And that's always, you go back and you look through history, there's always things that God has wanted accomplished in this world, and he's always used people to accomplish it. And so if you think about that, I always say, I'm a big believer in the providence of God, but if you believe you're here in this place at this time for a divine purpose, does it make life meaningful?
Yes.
It does for me. I don't know if it does for you guys, but it does for me. He's got me where he wants me for some reason. And that was a story of Esther, wasn't it? And that's what Mordecai is talking about. You can get way down this rabbit hole here, right, Dennis?
Yep.
But you go back and you just kind of think about how all this came to be. Remember, God doesn't necessarily cause things to happen, but he uses them to accomplish his purpose. Esther's parents die at a young age. Mordecai has to take her in and raise her. And he raises her up, and then she ends up coming into the king, and then you end up with Mordecai, kind of this, chief of the Jews, so to speak, who's able to communicate with her as she's sitting upon the throne. All those things happen in natural events. It wasn't no miracles that happened in between there. But it was God working out his divine purpose and plan. And so that's what Mordecai is talking about to Esther here. And he says something interesting here. He says, if you don't do your part in God's plan and purpose, what's going to happen? Is that what he said?
Use someone else.
Yeah. He said God's plan and purpose is still going to happen. He's just going to get somebody else to do it. Not going to be you, right? And you think about that through the history. You have Pharaoh and the children of Israel. God wanted Pharaoh to let the children of Israel go. Well, what would have happened if Pharaoh said yes? God's will and purpose would have been accomplished. But Pharaoh said no, and what happened? God's will and purpose was accomplished, right? God's will and purpose is always going to be accomplished. And he says, you're not going to have a part in it. You're going to miss out on your part that you're supposed to do. But hey, God will still take care of it. He'll raise up somebody else and he'll make it happen another way. Question number 10 here. So what warning did Mordecai give Esther if she didn't help her people? What do you say about her specifically? Yeah, he said, you're going to die, right? If you don't help out. And not just her herself. He said, your family's going to die too. So you think about that. Would that motivate you a little bit? Probably so. So we talked about question 12 here, the risk that Esther took, tried to save her people from annihilation. I don't know. Maybe her hope. She was a little hesitant at first, wasn't she? And I mean, understandably so. I mean, somebody comes up to you and says you got to put your life on the line. I don't think all of us would just go, okay, let's go. But after he talked to her and reasoned with her a little bit, she understood the severity of the situation. And so she agreed to do that. All right, so here's how she does it in chapter 5. Don't have a lot of questions left, but Esther comes into the presence of the king in the inner court. How does he react?
Womanly wiles. I think she used her womanly wiles.
I do too. I have no doubt. I mean, she was smart. She wasn't she wasn't the type of person who didn't know what she was doing. But think about it from this standpoint. He hadn't seen her in over a month, right? And so here she is, and she shows up again, and no doubt she's a beautiful woman. I mean, that's probably what attracted him to her in the first place, right? She put on all her royal clothing. She was dressed up really nice too. And so I think whenever he saw her, he remembered, that's the reason I married her, And he was happy. He was happy to see her. He's pleased to see her. And so he holds out his golden scepter, invites her into his presence. What does the king offer to Esther?
Anything she wants.
Yeah. He said, you name it up. And you think that's a literal phrase there? Do you think of any other place in the Bible you find it?
There must be, or he wouldn't ask the question.
I'm just asking. I don't know for sure.
Was it, well, with for a woman, Joseph.
Close. How about Herod? Remember when Herodias' daughter comes in and dances in front of him? He says, "What do you want? I'll give you up to half my kingdom." And a lot of people believe that was just kind of an idiomatic phrase that, again, don't take it literally, but it meant, I'll give you whatever I can give you. It is kind of interesting. You see it 2 times in the Bible. But basically, they believe that he's saying, I'll do what I can do, whatever you ask that's within reason, up to half the kingdom, I'll do that for you. And does she just come out and say, I want you to save the Jews? Oh man, she's really smart here. Because she says, well, I want to do something for you. I want to make you a meal, and I want you to come and spend some time together with me tomorrow night. And she said, I'm going to invite one of your best friends too. I want Haman to come with us too. And so they do that the first night, and then the king says, okay, so what do you want? And, she said, well, this night, I'm going to read between the lines here, between a little bit, but this night has been so enjoyable, I want to do it again. I'll have another meal tomorrow night and spend some more time with you. And then I promise I'll tell you what I want. And so that's kind of the thing that played out. We do read about Haman here, though. How did Haman feel after he was invited? This feast. Only the king and the queen and Haman. He's a pretty arrogant guy, wasn't he? The Bible says he went home and he started talking to everybody about how much money he had, about all his fame he had, the position, the job that he had. But when he left, he was infuriated. What infuriated him? Just spent dinner with the king and the queen of Persia. Remember who he didn't like?
He saw Mordecai.
Oh, yeah. He passed by Mordecai on his way out. Mordecai didn't salute him. He didn't bow before him. He didn't make a big to-do. He just pretended like he didn't even exist. And so he went home and he was furious. And, there's 16 is an interesting question. He had all this, he was successful in the eyes of the world. He was wealthy. What kept him from enjoying all those things? The one thing he didn't have, and it drove him crazy, didn't it? Is that Americans today? I mean, we have all this success, we have all this wealth, and what are we worried about? What we don't have, right? And it drives people crazy. If I could just get this, then I'd be happy. So ends up his wife and friends give him some advice. What advice do they give him? Yeah, kill him. That was the Persian way. You want something, you take it. You don't like somebody, you kill him. So they said, build some gallows and hang him and be done with it. All right, any comments or questions?